So today we have a lecture of Professor Heinrich, and let me introduce Heinrich. He is very famous Marx researcher. He received his doctorate in Berlin. He gained fame for his book Wissenschaft vom Wert, Science of the Value, and his commentary of the Capital, of Das Kapital, was recently published in translation in Korea. This is the Korean translation of his Capital commentary, and today's event also commemorates the publication of his book in Korea, and he worked as a professor at the University of Applied Science for Engineering and Economics in Berlin, and he is currently devoted to writing Marx biography, and this one is the first volume of Michael Heinrich's new series of Marx biography. So, okay. And today's discussion is about the history and the text of critique of political economy. And today's topic is what means to comment the beginning of Marx Capital and which capital should we use? And I will share in the chat room a file which Michael just gave me. And this is the, okay, I will share it now. Okay. Oh, moment. Oh, how can I? Okay. All right, I will share it anyway. So let's start the Michael's speech. So let us. Okay, Michael, please start your.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to speak again. I already joined the series in January. And also thank you very much for your introduction. As you already mentioned, the reason for the issue I choose today is the publication of my commentary, or to be precise, part 1 of my commentary. Part 2 will follow, of the beginning of Marx Capital. And this book, it was the Korean translation, appeared in January. And I also want to take the opportunity to say my thanks to the translator, Won-tae Kim. He did a very precise work. I don't speak Korean, so I couldn't check the translation. But he put some very good and precise questions to me. How this sentence is meant, what this word can be substitute one word by another word, and so on. And from these discussions, I could see how meticulous, how precise his work was, and so I thank him very much for this translation. The book, the part 1 of the commentary, is a very detailed commentary to chapter 1 and 2 of the first volume of Capital. Part 2 of the commentary, which is yet not translated, but I think it will also be translated in Korean, will cover the chapters 3 to 5, 5 in the German version of the book, chapter 3 to 7 in the English translation of Capital. The English translation of this commentary of both parts will appear in summer, this summer, in a monthly review press. So now the first question, when someone presents such an extensive commentary, the first question which has to be answered is why? Is it really necessary to do such an extensive commentary? And I will try to give an answer to this in the first part of my talk today. And in relation to this first part, we also have to have a short view on the different versions of Marx's presentation of value and money, which I gave a hint to in the title of my talk. The second question in the title is, and which capital should we use? This presupposes that there are different versions exist, and in the first part of my talk, I will also come to this question. In the second part of my talk, I will discuss what it means to comment a text like Capital. There is not only one possibility of commenting, there are different possibilities, and I will try to explain my choice, what choice I did for the style of commentary. And in the third part, I will discuss some short examples of my commentary to show in the short time I have why it is useful to occupy with such a project. So now let's start with my first part. Why do we need a commentary? Why we cannot just let Capital as it is and every reader can understand by herself or himself. There are many different interpretations and approaches to Capital, especially to the theory of value. And this indicates that there are some difficulties in the text. Otherwise, if there are no difficulties, we must assume that all other interpreters are rather stupid and only we ourselves have the correct interpretation. The others just cannot read Capital. But I think the things are not so easy. We have different interpretations and a number of them is really serious. We cannot just say they are nonsense. But why so different interpretations are possible? I think because the text itself has some difficulties which in different way can solve, and the different ways of solving the difficulties then gives cause to different interpretations. Insofar, the text is not so easy, and a comment at least should point to the difficulties. I don't say that I solved any of the difficulties or that now I present my interpretation as the only possible one, but I hope I can make the readers sensible for the different possibilities. The next point, the next reason for a commentary is that Marx himself, in the preface to the first edition of Capital in 1867, stresses that his book, the first volume, is not very difficult to read besides the beginning. So, with other words, he stresses that the beginning is difficult. And this, for me, was a reason to focus with my commentary on the beginning. I don't wanted to present a commentary for the whole first volume or even for the 3 volumes. No, I wanted to present a comment for this part, which Marx himself saw as a difficult part. And then there is a third reason for this commentary, and to this I want to discuss a little bit more in detail, that we have rather different versions from Marx himself presenting the relation between value and money. We have what is clear to everybody, I suppose, the first edition of 1867 with 2 versions already in this first edition. One version in chapter 1, one version of the value form in the appendix. Then we have the so-called reworking manuscript. The German title from the editors in Mega is Ergänzungen und Veränderungen, in which Marx provides the changes for the second edition, but he also provides us there with a kind of self-commentary. There are a few pages which I think are they are enormously enlightening to show what Marx tries to do when he is talking about value. These pages I gave to my commentary as also as an appendix. So in the different languages in which the commentary is already translated, it is also the first presentation of this crucial part of the reworking manuscript, so that the reader himself or herself can see if the conclusions I draw from this manuscript, if they are reasonable. Then we have as a next version the second edition of volume 1 of 1872-73, and finally the French translation, which Marx himself surveyed, which appeared between 1872 to 75. But these are not all versions. We can also consider some earlier versions, starting with Grundrisse from 1857-58, followed by the so-called original draft or Urtext from 1858, and then from a published text, a contribution to the critique of political economy of 1859. So in sum, we have 8 different versions dealing with the connection between value and money, which Marx wrote since 1857. And in the paper Sangwon mentioned, I sent this morning, I just gave a list of these 8 versions to make it a little bit easier for you to that you can imagine what I'm talking about. But when this list is not available, it is also no harm. Just have in mind these 8, that there are 8 versions. Now, if the later version would be always the best version, the things would be very easy. We just could focus on the last version and try to solve all problems, to have all discussions related this last version. But the things are not so simple. I will now try to show that there is not really a best version of these 8 different versions, that we have to consider at least 4 or 5 of these versions simultaneously when we want to have an adequate understanding of the beginning of capital. To make this clear, I will start with the last version, the French translation. Marx, in a famous letter to the publisher, said this version has a value by its own. Also, when a reader is familiar with German language, he should read, a French reader, he should read the French version. This is only half of the truth. To Danielson, the Russian translator of Capital, Marx wrote, when he translates the volume 1 in Russian, he should also consider the French translation, but with an enormous restriction. Marx sent a second letter and advised Danielson not to use the first 2 sections of the French translation, meaning the section commodity and money and the section the transformation of money in capital. And why Marx gave this advice, I learned when my commentary was translated in French a few years ago, and I had to learn that a lot of sentences, even of paragraphs I was commenting, were missing in this early French translation. Marx was not satisfied with the translation of Roy, this first translator, but he also had no time to rework the translation completely. So he decided, especially in the beginning of Capital, to erase everything what was badly translated. And so the first section on commodity and money in this early first translation is a rather cut-it version, a very cut-it version, where you not have the same information as in the full version of the German edition. Only in a later French translation in 20th century, the full text was translated, but not in this first text. And this is the reason, I think, why Marx advised Danielson not to use the French translation. So now, I'm very sorry, I must make a short interruption. It's the disadvantage when you are sitting at home giving a lecture. Someone is not stopping ring my doorbell. A second, please. So, sorry for this break, but this is the consequence, sitting at home. Yeah, so the French translation is the latest version, but for the problem of the beginnings of capital, we cannot use it. We can just exclude it. On the other hand, when we look to rather early versions, we see the opposite situation. Although they are early, 10 years or 8 years before the first volume of Capital appeared, we have to use them. Already Marx gives a hint in the preface of the first edition of volume 1. He wrote that when he deals with money and commodity circulation, what in the second edition was the third chapter, that some parts of these issues are treated more extensively in a contribution to the critique of political economy from 1859, and other parts are treated more extensive than in the earlier writing. So regarding the third chapter, money and commodity circulation, the early presentation in a contribution and in Capital are complements for each other. And therefore, in the second part of my commentary, when I'm commenting chapter 3, I relied strongly on a contribution because it can indeed solve some problems which are or it can give some hints to some strange formulations in chapter 3. But the most important point, looking regarding different versions, is the relation between the first and the second edition of Capital. In the first edition, I already mentioned this, we can find two versions of value form analysis. That we have there two versions, we have to thank Friedrich Engels and Louis Kugelmann, both friends of Marx, who had the chance to read the proof sheets during the printing process of Capital, and both advised Marx that the value form analysis in chapter 1 is too philosophical, too complicated for an ordinary reader. And Marx should try to find a more simple version of this important point. Marx didn't rework the first chapter. Instead, he wrote an appendix, the value form. So in the first edition, we have two different presentations of value form. And Marx in the preface says that he recommends the appendix, which is popularized, to the reader which is not familiar with dialectical thinking. So it is very clear from what Marx wrote in the preface that the appendix is a kind of simplified, popularized version of the presentation of chapter 1. Now, when Marx prepared the second German edition of Capital, he tried to avoid such a double presentation. The second edition has no appendix anymore. But when we compare the presentation of value form analysis in the second edition with the first edition, then it is very clear that the second edition follows the popularized appendix. And I think also Marx regarded this presentation as less strict, less scientific than the presentation in the first chapter of the first edition. We can see this when we precisely check the changes in the preface. Usually it is said Marx gave the preface of the first edition without any changes also to the second edition of Capital. But this is wrong. Marx erased one important sentence in the preface. In the preface of the first edition, he made a short comparison with a contribution, saying what is told there I give in the first chapter of Capital. And he continues then that the value form analysis, and now I quote in my own translation, it is difficult to understand because the dialectics is more precise, in German, viel schärfer. The dialectics is more precise as in the first presentation, meaning the presentation in a contribution to the critique of political economy. This praise of value form analysis, that the dialectics is more precise, is erased when Marx took the preface for the first edition. Obviously, after reworking the value form analysis according to the former appendix, Marx had not anymore the opinion that the dialectics is more precise. So, in some respect, we can say the second edition is a simplification, a popularization of the first edition, in some respect, not totally, of course. But on the other hand, we can also find some improvements in the second edition. In the reworking manuscript, where Marx, I mentioned this manuscript before, Marx wrote down the changes for the second edition, and also I mentioned this before, we can find there a kind of self-reflection, self-critique of his presentation of in the first edition. According to this manuscript, Marx also did some changes in the second edition. He inserted some paragraphs and sentences which are clearly an improvement. I will mention these improvements in the third part of my talk today when I give examples for my commentary. So in sum, we can say that there is no best version. The value form analysis in the first edition, in the first chapter of the first edition, is clearly better than in the appendix or in the second edition. But for example, the section on commodity fetishism, which only became a section in the second edition, is clearly better in the second edition than in the first edition. So there is definitely not a one best text we have to use when we want to treat and to read Capital scientifically. We have to use several versions. At least we have to use the first edition of Capital, we have to use the reworking manuscript, we have to use the second edition, and especially for chapter 3, we also have to use a contribution to the critique of political economy from 1859. Now, when someone reads Capital for the first time, we cannot give the advice, please read this whole bulk of texts. this person would be frightened and would say, oh, capital, maybe it's not my thing. Perhaps I should play football or something else, but not reading capital. So for the beginners, I would recommend to focus on the usual edition of capital, what is usually oriented to the fourth German edition edited by Friedrich Engels, but to pay big attention with the translation errors. For example, in English, for the translation of my commentary, we use something, and I hope you can hear me.
We are hearing. Yeah.
Okay, so I will
okay.
continue. The recommendation for beginners to take the usual capital, but in foreign languages to be very careful with the translation. I learned correcting the English translation of my commentary that there are a number of more or less serious translation errors in the Penguin edition of Capital. And I cannot check other languages, but I know that, for example, in Spanish, there exist 4 different translations of volume 1 of Capital. So also in other languages, there seem to be big problems with the translation. This is one recommendation, but nevertheless, also a beginner, someone who reads Capital for the first time, should not strictly restrict to one version of Capital. It will provide certain errors, and therefore, in my commentary, which I also recommend as a help for beginners, I also make use of other versions of the text. I think we cannot avoid this, but I try to do this in a way that even a beginner can work with this. But this now leads me to my second point, which I announced for this talk. The second point, which shall deal with the question, what means to comment? The first point, why commenting? Now, what means to comment? First, I must do a rather general remark that no comment, neither my comment nor the comment of anybody else, can be totally free from interpretation. Every comment transports also a kind of interpretation of the commentator. A kind of neutral comment, I think, is not possible. The only what we can do is to make this very clear to the reader and to make this visible to the reader. My general recommendation for the reader using my comment, therefore, was, please don't start reading with my comment. Start to read with a short section of Capital. 1 page, 2 pages, not more. And then go to the comment, try to see if the comment solves any of your reading problems, and then go back to the original text of Capital and try also to evaluate and maybe to criticize the comment I delivered. So it is the recommendation to make a critical use of the comment, of the commentary, and not just to believe what the commentator is telling. But I think we have to go one step further. And therefore, I distinguished two different types of commentary. Usually, a commentator knows much more than the text which is commented. The commentator knows also other texts of the author and uses these other texts. The reader knows only the text which is to be commented. And insofar, the reader usually cannot evaluate the commentary. The reader has only the choice either to trust the commentator or not to trust the commentator. In order to escape this trap as far as possible, I provided a kind of two-step commentary. The main line of my commentary relies only on the text under discussion. I only tried using the sentences also the reader has read to give some comments. But when it is necessary to take into account another text of Marx, I make this visible. I say, here comes an addendum. And even in German, and I think also in the Korean translation, it is made, the difference is visible by a different size of the letters or by a different format of the paragraph. So I have one part of the commentary which relates only to the text of capital the reader has read, so the reader immediately can evaluate my commentary, can check if it is plausible what I say or not. And then I have parts called addendum, where I need further texts. I also quote these texts, giving a hint to the reader. And in the appendices of my commentary, I publish such texts and give a further commentary of these supplementary texts. Insofar, I hope to empower the readers to criticize my commentary. I don't want that they just believe everything what Michael says is true. No, I want that they really work with this commentary. And in most commentaries I read, I must say I missed such a kind of critical stance against the own commentary. Usually the commentator presents himself or herself as the person who knows everything and who is ready to share his big wisdom with the reader. But this, I think, is a kind of authoritarian behavior in commenting, and whatever possible was to do, I tried to avoid this authoritarian attitude. And I would be very interested when the book is read in Korea to see or to hear about the experience of the readers, if they could really do this evaluation of my commentary by giving additional information, as I hoped, or if it was still too complicated. So now, after trying to sketch what type of commentary or what combination of types I attempted to present, I will come to my last point to give some examples of the way I'm commenting the text of Capital. I start with the first sentence of the first chapter of Capital, a sentence when you are familiar with Capital, you know this sentence probably by heart. If we have some beginners in the audience who didn't occupy this Capital until now, starting with the first sentence means no knowledge is presupposed. Everybody should know this. I read the sentence in the translation of the English translation of the Penguin edition. The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Our investigation, therefore, begins with the analysis of the commodity. It seems very easy, very simple. Marx starts with the commodity, and very briefly, he gives some hints why he starts with the commodity and not with money or labor or whatever. But things are not so easy, as we can see very easily. It starts already with the first term, the wealth of societies, in German, der Reichtum der Gesellschaften. On the one hand, if you know a little bit economic literature, it is clear that Marx hints to the title of Adam Smith about the wealth of nations. And it is already a kind of critique of Smith, because Marx stresses capitalist form of production. What Smith in this title didn't stress, wealth of societies, is used as a very general term. But this is not the important thing, and when you don't know Smith, you will miss this small clue. But another clue you should see by careful reading. Wealth, the term wealth, is just taken from everyday language. There is no explanation what wealth means here. Obviously, Marx relies on that the reader knows what is meant by wealth. When we are a reader, when we do a reading, a very careful reading, then we should write down such a term and should look if in the following pages, in the following considerations, we will learn something about wealth. What is learned about wealth? What is wealth? What does Marx mean with wealth? And indeed, already in the next page, we can learn a little bit more about wealth, but not in this paragraph. But there is another interesting point we can learn here. Marx writes, the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails. The capitalist mode of production prevails. This implicitly makes a difference, at least between three different types of societies. A society without capitalist mode of production, a society with capitalist mode of production, but this mode of production is not prevailing. It is subordinated to other modes. And third, a society in which the capitalist mode of production is prevailing. And obviously, Marx only wants to deal with this third type. This is very important for the understanding of the whole section on commodity and money. As many of you probably know, there is a big discussion, or there was a big discussion, what is the content of this section of value of commodity and money. Marx is not talking about capital in the first 3 chapters. Is he dealing with a pre-capitalist commodity producing economic system? Some remarks of Friedrich Engels go in this direction. Already in the first sentence, when we read it carefully, we see that Marx stresses the commodity he wants to analyze is a commodity in which, in a society in which the capitalist mode of production is prevailing. So this is a very crucial formulation. But we are just at the beginning of this paragraph. A lot has to follow. Already the next word, I start again from the beginning. The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as. Now we must do a little bit wording. To appear is the translation of the German word erscheinen. There is also a similar German word scheinen. Scheinen and erscheinen. The correct translation of scheinen is to seem. Scheinen and erscheinen are completely different words. They sound very, very close to each other, but the meaning is completely different. In German, we use scheinen when we are not sure if something is the case. I can, for example, say, this coin seems to be made out of gold. Die Münze scheint aus Gold gemacht zu sein. Then I express, okay, it looks like, but perhaps it is not really gold. When I use the term erscheinen, to appear, there is not a question that I have some doubts. Someone erscheint, someone appears, then he comes. Okay, maybe he comes in a certain dress, in a certain role, and the role could also be different, but that this person, this thing appears is a fact and not a semblance. So in German, we have to distinguish very carefully if the word scheinen or erscheinen is used. Unfortunately, in the Penguin translation and also in other translations, this difference is not always made. Sometimes Marx uses the word scheinen and it is translated with to appear. What is wrong? Or Marx uses the derivative noun from scheinen, der Schein, the semblance, and it is translated with the appearance. So I don't know how it is in Korean language, if there are similar confusions in capital translation, but I recommend to be very careful if Marx uses scheinen to seem or erscheinen to appear. And here he uses erscheinen to appear. Wealth appears as an immense collection of commodities. When we now have in mind what erscheinen to appear means, then we can conclude that wealth can also appear in a different form. In another society, wealth will not appear as an immense collection of commodities. We don't know as what it will appear, but the the appearance as commodities is a special historical form of appearance and not a natural form of wealth. And already in this, as I mentioned before, we can find a fundamental critic against Adam Smith, who didn't do such a difference. Smith believed that the appearance of wealth in commodity form is a kind of natural appearance of wealth. Now the paragraph continues. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Maybe when you read this for the first time in English, you will feel a little bit strange that there is written elementary form and not elementary unit. Marx already in the preface speaks of economic forms. This is his issue, not economic things, economic forms. And insofar to speak of the individual commodity as elementary form stresses the importance of the form aspect. And now the concluding sentence in this first paragraph: our investigation therefore begins with the analysis of the commodity. Usually the most readers accept this, therefore. Our investigation therefore begins with the analysis of the commodity. But did Marx really give a reason why he starts with the commodity? Until now, he only said the commodity is the form of appearance of wealth in bourgeois societies, in societies in which capitalist mode of production prevails. But is this already enough that we understand, yes, the analysis has to start with the commodity? I don't think so. What is with money? What is with the labor which produces the wealth, and so on? This, therefore, here has no reason. So Marx, in some respect, is playing with us. He says, I start with the commodity, and I have good reason to start with the commodity. It is a result of my research process. But the reader cannot really evaluate if the start with the commodity is really necessary. It needs a long time that the reader really can understand that commodity and nothing else as commodity is the form of appearance of wealth, and that the commodity is so elementary that you have to start with it. Until now, a cautious reader just should make here a question mark, should note, okay, Marx says, therefore I start with the commodity, but it is not really clear why the commodity, why to start with the commodity. And perhaps we can learn later when we continue reading more about this. But for the moment, like with the wealth, the second word in the paragraph, we have to note down this as an open question. In the commentary, I say even a little bit more. I need 2 or 3 pages in order to comment these 4 lines. But I try to present this also as a model of reading, a model of cautious, careful reading a text like the beginning of Capital. So this was my first example. What I'm doing in the commentary. Now I see the time is already running. As usual, when I talk, I run out of time. So if you are patient enough to give me another, okay, 10 minutes, 7 to 10 minutes, I will give you some other examples which also are related to a discussion which is very important in the history of Marxist debates. When and where value is determined, is value already determined in production, or do we need really production and circulation? Can we speak about commodities already in the production process or only after the production process? I saw before that my friend Fred Mosley also joined here the discussion, and this is one of our big conflicting points. What is this production, value, and commodity? So some hints to this from the commentary. Already at the beginning of Capital, in the first subsection of the chapter 1, Marx gives a first determination, a first consideration on value. I again quote the text which we can find in the Penguin translation of Capital. I suppose you all need this famous, you all know this famous sentence. As crystals of this social substance, which is common to them all, they are values, commodity values. It follows Marx gave the first briefly a discussion of the difference between concrete and abstract labor. Concrete labor produces use value, but in exchange we abstract from all use value. Insofar we abstract from all concrete features of labor. What is left is only abstract labor, and this is the social substance. As crystals of this social substance, which is common to them all, them, the commodities, they are values, commodity values. In the first edition of Capital, we can find a similar formulation where Marx also speaks of a common substance. Also, the German term is not substance which is common, but is common substance. So the translation here is not very literal from the German. As well, in the translation, in the English translation of the first edition or the first chapter of the first edition of Capital, and here in the Penguin edition, we in both times, in both cases, we see the word common. But in German, Marx uses different words in the first edition and in the second edition. In the first edition, Marx speaks of gemeinsame Substanz, gemeinsam. And gemeinsam, for gemeinsam, the correct translation is common. Two things are red. Red is the common feature of these things. In the second edition of Capital, Marx didn't use the German word gemeinsam, but he used the German word gemeinschaftlich. He speaks of gemeinschaftliche Substanz. Gemeinschaftlich means in community. Only as a community we have something. When I own a car together with my wife, then we have this car in community. I am not, as an individual, a car owner. My wife, as an individual, is also not a car owner. Only we both together, as a community, own the car. This is a big difference regarding my neighbor. My neighbor has a car, I have a car, so I can say the common feature of my neighbor and me is we are both car owners. But this is completely different from owning a car in community. And that Marx changes from gemeinsam to gemeinschaftlich, what is totally hidden in the English translation, is a clear sign that he means with value as a common feature of commodities, not a common like two red things have the common attribute of being red, what they have also outside of their relation to each other, but that it is meant something what the two things only have in relation, only in the exchange relation, we can speak of value as an attribute two commodities have in community. This thought is more extensively presented in the reworking manuscript, Ergänzungen und Veränderungen, which I gave as an appendix to the commentary. Another change, and this, by the way, is a change I said before, when you remember, that in the second edition of Capital, on the one hand, we find some parts which are simplified, popularized, like value form analysis, but other parts or remarks which are an improvement. So to change here from gemeinsam to gemeinschaftlich is a clear improvement. Another improvement, an important improvement, you can find in the section on commodity fetishism at the end of chapter 1. Here Marx included a completely new paragraph, or he inserted new lines in an existed paragraph. I just read the beginning of these new lines. It is, if you want to see it, in the Penguin edition on page 166. Now I read the lines. It is only by being exchanged that the products of labor acquire a socially uniform objectivity as values. Objectivity as values, the German term is Wertgegenständlichkeit. It is a kind, a word which Marx formed. I didn't find a text prior to Marx which used this term Wertgegenständlichkeit. So I suppose Marx himself formed this word. It is only by being exchanged that the products of labor acquire a socially uniform objectivity as values, which is distinct from their sensuously varied objectivity as articles of utility. This division of the product of labor into a useful thing and a thing possessing value appears in practice only when exchange has already acquired a sufficient extension and importance to allow useful things to be produced for the purpose of being exchanged, so that their character as values, and now another crucial formulation, so that their character as values has already to be taken into consideration during production. Marx didn't write that the character as values already exist in production. He wrote that the character of values, a character which the commodities appear in exchange, is taken into account. And this is for me also a clear hint that Marx opposes to this approach which says value is already determined in production. There is already a third example, and with this I come to an end of my examples, which is not which is not inserted in the second German edition and also not in the English translation. But this following sentence is part of the reworking manuscript, and Marx took it also in the French translation. So I suppose that it is not in the second German edition is just a mistake. It is from the reworking manuscript. It is very clear already where the sentence belongs. And as I told you, it is included in the French translation. It is the same paragraph I already started to read on page 166 in the Penguin edition. I read just what is said in the English and German version. If we reduce them, the commodities, to the characteristic, no, not them, the different kinds of labor. If we reduce them to the characteristic they have in common, that of being the expenditure of human labor power in the abstract. And now in the reworking manuscript and in the French translation follows the sentence, the reduction of the different concrete acts of private labor to this abstract thing of equal human labor happens only through exchange, which really equalizes the products of different labor acts. So the reduction of concrete labor to abstract labor, to equal human labor, happens only in exchange. When we talk about production, only about production, we cannot talk about abstract labor. We talk, of course, about concrete labor. We can measure concrete labor. When we measure the time a carpenter needs to produce something, we measure the concrete time of carpenter labor, but we don't measure abstract labor. Abstract labor, very clearly stated, exists only when we reduce concrete labor to abstract, and this reduction only happens in exchange. So I extended enough my time. I hope I could give you an impression what I was trying to do in this commentary, why I think it is necessary to write such an extensive commentary. what kind of commentary I tried to present, a commentary which gives the reader the possibility to criticize the commentator. And with these examples I choose, I hope I could convince you that the commentary is not only for the absolute beginners to give them some explanations of rare terminology or so on, but that a commentary really is necessary for a deeper understanding of the text. But by this also comes to the edge of interpretation. I said also at the beginning of part 2, we cannot strictly separate commentary and interpretation. We only can try to make visible that each commentary also includes an interpretation, and that the reader is capable, is able to come to his or her own evaluation. This was my my aim in the commentary, and to give a hint to this was the aim here of this talk about how to comment capital. Thank you very much for your patience and for your attention all the time. And now I think we have some more time for discussion, questions, and so on. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Niall. Okay. And before we start audience discussion, Fred Mosley requested in advance that he has something to comment about Mihail's talk. So, Fred, could you please tell us something? Yes. Oh, your mic is not.
I'm here.
Fred.
Okay.
Oh, yes. Yes.
I'm
okay.
Fred, I can see you, but maybe you cannot see me.
No, I can see you. Good to see you again, Mikhail. We're long-term friends and comrades. We are both intensely interested in Marx's theory, and we disagree fundamentally. That perhaps especially chapter 1. But I think we have been making progress in mutual understanding. And I would like to try to continue that progress. And I want to focus on one point in particular in section 1. Okay, and that is, and the derivation of abstract labor and socially necessary labor time in section 1. And the point you raised about where is socially necessary, where is value produced in production or exchange. So, and the point I want to emphasize is that this derivation of socially necessary labor time value in section 1 is based on the fundamental premise that each commodity is in principle equivalent to all other commodities. This is, as you pointed out, the analysis in section 1 is of the commodity as representative of the total commodity product, right? So analyzing a commodity, its properties, right? It has use value, it has exchange value, right? Exchange value is a general property, right? Exchange value that this one commodity that we're analyzing has, it's equal in definite proportions to all other commodities. Right. So from this, and the whole logic of section 1 is based on this premise, right? That each commodity by its nature, right, is in principle equivalent to all other commodities in definite quantities. And Marx argued, of course, that it follows from this relation of equality that all commodities must possess a common property. Each and every commodity must possess a common property, right? And must possess a common property in a definite magnitude, a definite quantity that enables them to be equated, right, as equivalents. And Marx argued that this common property is, of course, abstract labor. The quantity of abstract labor is socially necessary labor time. And it is this quantities of socially necessary labor time contained by the commodity we're analyzing, this commodity, right? And contained by all other commodities that determines the proportions in which exchange values exist, in which a commodity is considered equivalent to all other commodities, right? And socially necessary labor time is the labor time necessary to produce, Marx states clearly in section 1, to produce each commodity, right? And therefore is determined by the characteristics of production in production, right? So Mikhail has argued that maybe in the second edition, Marx was changing his mind or ambivalent about this determination of socially necessary labor time, not just in production, but only in exchange with other commodities. And so, but I have actually examined in some detail the textual evidence that Mikhail discussed, and I'm working on a paper on that, but I will not focus on that right now. We can talk later, but I want to emphasize this logic, the logic of chapter 1, beginning with each commodity as equivalent to all other commodities, which implies a common property possessed by each and every commodity, and then that abstract labor and the quantity of socially necessary labor time. Each commodity possesses this in and of itself, and it is this common property that enables the exchange proportions to be determined. So I'd like to hear your comments, Mikhail, on the crucial role of the relation of equality between this representative commodity that we're analyzing and all other commodities. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, for your statement, which I think was very clear and which is very good for discussing. And maybe you will be very surprised that I agree to your first two statements already. Your first statement was each commodity is equivalent to all other commodities. And your second statement, which is a corollary from this first, all commodities must possess a common property. To these two statements, I totally agree with you. But I think we have a difference. What is a commodity? The way I understand, especially the logic of the first chapter, and also the logic of the reworking manuscript, a commodity exists only in exchange. In the production process, of course, the producer thinks about the later commodity character. When a carpenter produces a table, then the carpenter already considers at which price I will be able to sell this table. So the producer takes into consideration, precisely as Marx wrote in this sentence in the section on commodity fetishism, which I read before. In production, the commodity character comes into consideration of the producer, but the commodity is not existing. the commodity exists only in the exchange relation. And insofar is the feature as commodity and the common property of commodities, which you mentioned and which I agree to you, there must be some common properties. These common properties have the special attribute that they exist only in relation, because the commodity exists only in the exchange relation. Also value can only exist in exchange relation. And therefore, when you look to the logic of chapter 1, Marx didn't start with the production process. The chapter on the laboring process comes much later. Marx, in the very beginning of chapter 1, starts with a very simple exchange relation, wheat against iron. And from this exchange relation, he says there must be something common, a third element which is common in wheat and in iron. But the Marx consideration is always a consideration of the exchange relation and not of something outside the exchange relation. And insofar, I think our main difference is what is a commodity. And my position in very short, it exists only in the exchange process. Before and afterwards, it is a use value. Also, value exists only in the exchange process, but the determination of value is not a result only of the exchange process. You had one formulation where you referred to me, where you said socially necessary labor time is determined only in exchange. No, this I don't say. It exists only in exchange, but the determination is a kind of joint venture of capitalist production and capitalist circulation. So the existence is only in exchange, but of course it also is to a certain degree determined by production, but it doesn't exist there. This, I think, is the main, in my view, the main difference between us two.
Can I just add one follow-up, please?
Shortly, please.
Yeah. But in section 1, right, I agree he's not starting with production. He's starting with the analysis of the commodity, a commodity as representative. Production has already happened, right? This is a produced commodity that he's analyzing. What are the properties of this commodity, right? Its use value and its exchange value, and it's the nature that it's equivalent to all other commodities, right? As the nature of the commodity, and that implies that there must be, that each commodity must possess singly and individually, and to be compared, to be shared, so that the exchange proportions can be determined. Thank you. Sorry for.
Just, I don't want to extend now, otherwise only we two would discuss. But the difference I see is Marx doesn't start with a commodity in the sense of one commodity. He starts with the exchange relation, what already presupposes two commodities. His first example is not just wheat. His first example is wheat against iron. And so already he starts with two commodities in relation. And in my view, this is a big difference to consider one isolated thing and saying this is a commodity. But okay, we have to continue the discussion maybe in another place.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have 3 requests to talk. And are there any further requests? If no, I think we can finish with these three. Oh, there's another. Oh, four. So we can finish with these four questions. First, I will announce name. First, Paul Zarembka, and second, Songjin, and third, Giovanni, and the fourth, Vanessa. So we have these four questions. Please go ahead, Paul.
Michael, your talk is actually dovetails with mine next week very much. So I really welcome everything you had to say. But I think that there is a ninth edition of Capital, which should be the definitive edition of Capital, which is what I'll be arguing next week. And that is that Marx made clear instructions for what Marx's third edition would be, not Engels's third edition, Marx's third edition. He was, for example, invited to make addressing the issue of making an American edition in 1877. Anyway, if you take Marx's instructions, which I have carefully done, and taken it up to 1882. I call that the 1882 edition. Marx wants to use almost all of parts 1 through 6 in the German. Forget about the French. Use the German second in the third, but we get into real problems when we get to the accumulation of capital. We get major errors that Engels makes. But we know what Marx wanted, so we could provide that ninth edition as the definitive edition, and we can still go ahead to how Marx is changing his ideas over time. That's a great discussion, but at least we would start with what Marx's final edition would look like. That's all I want to say today. I just make one comment that Danielson was translating the first edition, not the second edition. That's all.
Okay, thank you. And
can I respond at once, or?
I think you can go on. You can.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Just a short answer to this. I didn't mention this later remarks because they don't give us many information about the theme of the beginning of Capital: value, commodity, and money. But the idea that this is the definite final edition, what you just said, I have my doubts, because Marx also after these remarks planned a thoroughgoing reworking on chapter 1. We don't know what exactly he wants to do, but by looking to his excerpts, we can have some ideas. For example, he did historical studies about late Middle Ages, what could be a hint that he wanted to rework and in some respect to generalize his chapter on primitive accumulation. Because it became clear for Marx that primitive accumulation, as he described it in Capital, is a special case of England and not a general case. And perhaps he wanted to extend this. So I think we don't have really a final version of Capital, because Marx, at least we can conclude this from his letters and from his excerpts, planned much bigger reworking. If he would ever manage to do this, even if he lived 10 years longer, I have my doubts, because my impression is that the growth of planning in Marx's mind was much bigger than what a single person really was able to do. So the plans were always not to fulfill. But okay, this is another theme what is beyond our theme today.
Thank you. And Sungjin has Sungjin wrote 2 questions. Sungjin, could you please summarize your question so that Mihail can answer?
Yeah, I will read my questions
Yes.
written in the chat room. Michael, thank you very much for the excellent and trenchant presentation. Your comparison of the various versions of Marx Capital Volume 1 and reading of the first paragraph of Capital Volume 1 are extremely informative and useful. I have 2 questions for you. You argued that the first part of Capital of the French edition, especially part on commodity and money, has some disadvantage compared to the first and second German editions. However, as for the latter part of the Capital Volume 1, especially on capital accumulation, like historical tendency of capitalist accumulation, I think the French edition has some superiorities that cannot be found in other editions. So what do you think? And second, your reading of the first sentence of Capital Volume 1 is very good. I also found your reading is similar with, yeah, I think John Holloway, he was here a moment before. As for the first sentence of Capital Volume 1, there seems to be no difference between your new reading of Marx and the open Marxist reading. Then what is the main contesting point between your new reading of Marx Capital and the open Marxist reading of Capital? So.
Okay, with your first question, it is very easy for me to answer. I agree with you. What you said, that especially the later parts of the French translation contain some improvements compared with the second German edition. And therefore, Marx advised also Danielson for these later parts always to check the French translation. But this doesn't count for the beginning. So I think in this issue, I completely agree with you. With the second question, it is a little bit more difficult. I know from John Holloway a paper also about the first sentence of Capital, where he stresses especially the point of wealth, or the notion of wealth. However, I have certain problems with this argumentation, because John brings into the discussion a notion of wealth which is taken from the whole Marx, from the young Marx, from the middle Marx, from Capital, from everywhere. And I think we should be a little bit more focused on Capital. What is the notion of wealth in Capital? Maybe it is the same notion as in the young Marx, but we shouldn't just presuppose this. It is a point which must be discussed, and you have to give reason. I would say there is a difference between the notion of wealth in the early Marx and in the late Marx, but we cannot just presuppose something. And so far, in this special point, I think I have a difference with John. The later part of your question, new reading of Marx and open Marxism, what are the differences, the contested points? I must say, I have some difficulties with this kind of classification. we shouldn't exaggerate classifications, that a classification always should be a kind of tool, of helper. For example, to stress new reading of Marx, okay, you have to say what is the old reading. I can say, okay, in an old reading, fetishism played not a crucial role, form analysis played not a crucial role, the notion of class didn't took into account that Marx's notion of class changed between Communist Manifesto and Capital, and so on. So such a term, new reading of Marx, gives you a help, a kind of abbreviation. But now to construct an ontology and to say, oh, the new reading of Marx is this, the open Marxism is that, I have my problems. I would prefer to ask John, what do you think is the essential point of open Marxism? And then I could say, I agree or I disagree. But these ontologies of divisions, they come very, very quickly to their limits. And in so far, I cannot give you really a satisfying answer.
Okay, and next, Giovanni has wrote his question. Can you please explain your question again? I think Giovanni, maybe you don't have microphone. Okay,
Okay, I see his question here. I can read the question.
Good.
So question from
No, I
Giovanni.
do you hear me?
Oh, we are hearing.
Hello?
We hear you.
Do you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I don't hear you anymore. Do you hear me or?
We are listening.
We can hear you.
Maybe there's a network problem.
Okay. Now I hear you. Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Listening.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry. Okay, Michael, thank you for the wonderful speech. I understand very well when you say that, okay, I am a third-year PhD student with a thesis on Marx and Althusser, just to briefly introduce myself. So I understand very well when you say that the equivalence between the different commodities happens only, of course, in the sphere of exchange. But before, when you answer to Mosley, you say that it's a corollary from that the two, the commodities have something in common, no? That is value. But I don't think that is really a corollary. It seems more a kind of Marx fundamental assumption. So it's a kind of reification of a relation. So I understand you very well when you speak about relation, but then when you say that a corollary of this relation is a substance, even if it's a social substance like value, you are committing a kind of reification mistake like Marx is doing sometimes. I don't know if I have been clear. Or... So think about when Marx is criticizing Bailey in the pages of Capital, like for example, pages, speaking about the Penguin version 148, you know, that he says, Bailey makes this mistake to think that if you compare, the relation is everything, but then he goes on to say, no, the relation is just the appearance of a substance. Don't you think that he's doing a kind of reification that is moving away from the idea of relation, that you are doing the same in a sense? Thank you.
No, I don't think I do the same. Because the interesting question is, what kind of substance? And is it a substance like we can find it in the classical philosophy, like, for example, Aristotle speaks about substance? Or is it a more relational substance? And what I think, and maybe also in this point, I agree with Fred. When we speak of equivalence, then we must have something in which this equivalence is founded. We cannot just take equivalence as an arbitrary feature. But in what this equivalence is founded, it must not be a kind of classical substance. And I would say in many very traditional Marxist approaches, it is seen as such a classical substance, for example, in all these labor embodied approaches. This, I would agree with you, Giovanni, this is very problematic. But what Marx here is doing, what he calls substance, I think is in some respect also a critique of a long philosophical line of discussing substance from Aristotle to Spinoza to Hegel. He didn't really unfold this meaning of substance. Insofar, it is a lot of interpretation when I say this, but I don't think it is necessarily a kind of reification as you seem to presuppose.
Okay, thank you very much. It's more clear. I'm not totally convinced, but it's more clear.
Maybe as an additional hint, in my Science of Value, this big book, what I hope finally will appear in English this year, I give at this point a mathematical analogy when you have certain relations on a sample, the way you have to construct a new sample by the equivalence relation. And what is called in mathematics, now I missed the English term, in German it is Quotientenmenge.
Yes, I understand what you mean. It's the quotient, I mean, the minimum commune denominator.
The sample of the quotients. And this quotient constitutes in mathematics a known sample. And I think with value, something similar happens.
Yes, but it's like when Marx speaks about a universal equivalent, no? I mean, this doesn't need to be the same physical matter than the other commodities, right? So the fact that you have this common denominator doesn't mean that it's a substance at all, because I mean, it's not the substantial part that is used to make the equivalence. I don't know if right? Yeah. Okay, thank you, Michael.
Okay. Next question is of Vanessa. And Vanessa, do you like to say something more, or?
I didn't want to say anything more, but I can just read my question out. It's sort of a selfish question because I'm doing my research on the economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63 and then 63 to 65/67, depending on my German by that time. But my question was, so part of your 8 versions that you listed on the document, I'm curious as to why you didn't include those manuscripts, because often, you know, after the Grundrisse, there's those manuscripts and then there's Capital. Is that because that's often associated with Capital Volume 2 and 3 and the theories of surplus value, or is it a different reason for why these aren't included in your versions? Yeah, thank you.
I think I didn't understand you completely. What is not included?
So the economic manuscripts from 1861 to 63 and then 63 to 65. Yeah.
I was talking here about commodity and money. When you look at the manuscript of 61 to 63, it starts as a direct continuation of a contribution of the critique of political economy. And so the part which we are discussing doesn't exist in manuscript 61, 63. You have in the theories of surplus value a lot of important remarks, especially when Marx is discussing Samuel Bailey, but you have not a kind of analysis, a chapter or something. You have single remarks. Regarding the manuscript of 63 to 65, you know from the manuscript for volume 1, only chapter 6 has left, the results of the immediate process of production. And insofar, it would be very, very interesting to have the complete manuscript and to see what Marx did in this manuscript. My assumption, but this is a wild guess, is that Marx again in 63 started with the transformation of money in capital, because in 63 he had the idea only to write a very short abbreviation of a contribution from 59. And when you have in mind that Marx in his letter to Engels said, January the 1st, 1866, I started with writing down volume 1. And he needed 1 year to copy and to make ready for the printing process what already exists. It is very clear that in this year, Marx did not only copy. So I suppose that the first chapter, as we know it in the first edition of Capital, was written in the first 8 months of 1866, because the manuscript of 63, 65 didn't have a part, and the manuscript of 61 to 63 also had no part. And insofar, I didn't relate to this because we have nothing in our records, but my assumption is that also nothing existed. And this is the reason why Marx spent in the year 1866 so much time for something which should be just a copy, a process of copying. But okay, it's a wild guess. I cannot prove this.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
And when you work, just to say this, because afterwards we miss each other, I think when you work on these manuscripts and in this time, please contact me and tell me what you are working about. I would be very interested in this issue.
I will tell you once I find out.
Oh, you can contact me also at the beginning, not at the end only.
Thank you very much.
And Marcel wrote some comment in the chatting room. Marcel, do you have something to talk, or is it just a chat comment?
Oh, it's really just a suggestion, maybe to slightly rephrase Michael's proposition in terms of social form. So if the substance that we seem to be, or he and Fred seem to be arguing about, if we understand this substance in terms of social form, then it is obvious that it is not an Aristotelian substance, but the substance is the social relationship. And obviously in the type of society we're talking about, exchange relations are central to how social relationships are organized. So if the essence of the commodity form is value as a social form, then and if that substance is constituted societally or socially, then it is obvious that it is more the way Michael is suggesting, that the essence of value is constituted through exchange relations, because that is essentially how societal relationships are organized in our type of society. So now I thought maybe if we put it like this, Fred or others might be more prepared to agree with what to me seems pretty obvious, but perhaps I simply don't understand what the contrary position actually is, because I don't know what the essence of value could be if not something constituted by society. So I think that is pretty clear in Marx, but that is just that is a comment, not a question.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think I agree with your comment. I cannot say a critical remark to your comment. I think I agree with your view on this point.
Mhm. Oh, all right. So I think time is up, so we can finish now. So I thank you very much, Michael, for the talk and your discussion, and also thank you very much for interesting discussions. And okay, let's finish and see you next time.
Yeah. And thank you very much to your attention and the interesting discussion, because I always also learn something by such interesting discussion. So thank you very much also from my side.
Professor Heinrich, I have to talk about another things like administrative things like